Hey guys, it's me, Josh again. We're starting off another series. Last week we finished up our previous series. I hope you guys enjoyed that and learned from it. I hope you're applying it to your lives. But this week we're starting a new series called Dealing with Doubt. And our first lesson in this series, which I'll be doing today, is belief and unbelief and how those are both simultaneously in our relationship with God and how neither one of them are a bad thing. A lot of people, new Christians, people who have been Christians for a while, they think that disbelief or doubting God and questioning God is a bad thing or a sinful thing that separates us from God and takes us further from God. And this week we're going to learn that it's not. It's simply a natural thing that we do as humans. It's simply something that we're not going to be able to avoid. As humans, it's natural for us to doubt and to question things and to even want to fully understand things more deeper. But we have two passages, and the first one is in Mark chapter 9, verse 14. So if you would turn there, and you can pause if you need more time to turn there, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. Verse 14 says, "When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. 'And what are you arguing with them about?' Jesus said. And a man in the crowd answered, 'Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground, and he foams at the mouth, gnashing his teeth, and he becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not.' And Jesus says," this is in red letters in my Bible, Jesus says, "You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you, and how long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought the boy, and when the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been doing this?" And the father said, "From childhood." He answered, "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," said Jesus, almost asking, like, did you say if I can? Because this is questioning. It's questioning, like, Jesus' power, right? Not having full faith in Jesus' power. That's kind of what that question implies. But Jesus says, if you can, everything is possible for one who believes. And immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And the spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. And the boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. So we see here that there's a large crowd, and the crowd consists of simple townspeople, teachers of the law, the disciples, and then a father and his son. And Jesus sees this crowd, so he walks over to them and he says, "Hey, what's going on here? What's all this arguing?" And maybe there was some shouting. He says, "What's happening?" And this is when the father steps forward and says, "I have my son here who is possessed by a demon, an evil spirit. And whenever this evil spirit takes over, it throws him to the ground. He foams at his mouth and gnashes his teeth. And many times over the years, the spirit has tried to throw him into water and into fire to kill him." And that's something scary that I'm not a father, but I don't have to be to imagine how scary that would be. Even just imagining for myself how scary that would be. One of my little cousins, and it's on a whole nother level for a father to see their own child being thrown into a fire, possessed by a demon, being thrown into water. That's a scary thought, right? But he says that the father says, "I've already asked your disciples to help me, but they couldn't do it." And so Jesus has this conversation with the father and asks how long he's been doing it, how long the son's been possessed, and the father says he's been like this since childhood. So this is probably a few years, a couple or a few years where the son's been possessed by an evil spirit. And you can see the father says, "If you could do this," if you could, would you take the spirit out of him? And so that phrase, "if you could," it implies a bit of doubt or a lack of understanding of what Jesus can do. So Jesus repeats that to show how wrong that is. Not wrong, because doubt's not wrong. Jesus points that out to show the doubt, to show where the man is doubting, and says that in order for this to happen, you have to believe, right? Um, and the boy's father said, "I do believe. Help me overcome my belief." So he says, "I believe in you, but as a human, I have unbelief in my heart. Will you help me, God, to overcome this unbelief?" And it's important to see that Jesus doesn't um, shun him or tell him his belief is bad. That's why I corrected myself there. Jesus doesn't say your disbelief is horrible, or Jesus doesn't say no because you don't believe. Jesus simply sees the Father's desires and sees the Father wanting Jesus to rid him of his unbelief, and Jesus um, rids the boy of the demon. It says that the boy fell to the ground and the demon came out of him, and the boy appeared lifeless, that many people said he was dead, but Jesus helped the boy up to his feet. Um, and that was the end of this in verse 27, that the boy no longer had the evil spirit in him. And so our first point is that faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive. Um, Faith and doubt, they they correlate. We're going to have both of those. In many instances, we're going to have both of them at the same time, just like the Father does here when he says, "I believe, help me to get rid of my unbelief." As humans, we have lack of faith sometimes, but we still have the faith. And the first question to ask here, how would you describe the Father and what he had gone through? How do you imagine his demeanor, his facial expressions, his tone of voice, feelings, and mindset? And I imagine that when Jesus walks over and asks what's going on here, this father may be frustrated, may seem hopeless. That, like I said, this child may have been possessed by an evil spirit for a few years, a couple years. It's probably been some length of time, and so the father could have lost hope by this point. And then he may have found hope whenever he found the disciples, and then when they couldn't do it, he may have gotten angry because yet again he went to someone to heal his son, and they couldn't do it. But so he may have been agitated. But when Jesus comes to him, I imagine whenever he says, "I do believe, help me overcome my belief," you could see desperation and longing, desire. He may have you'd see a lot of strong emotions because there was hope again, as he knew, "Oh, I believe Jesus could do this." There was hope and desperation and longing for it. And the second question, did he have a legitimate reason to doubt that things would change for his son? And like I just said, this has probably been a couple years, a few years. It's been some length of time, so he has several reasons to doubt it. He's seen how strongly this evil spirit affects his son, and he's seen all these different people who weren't able to do it, including the disciples of Jesus. And the third question, how would you explain the Father's faith in your own words? We've kind of already done that. He has faith, but he also has unbelief. And he shows that whenever he says, "If you can, Jesus." That shows his unbelief. But then he shows his faith by saying that he does believe and asking Jesus to rid him of his own belief. And that his unbelief. And that shows not only belief, that shows belief in two different situations. In God's ability to rid the Son of the evil spirit, but it also shows his belief in God to get rid of the Father's own disbelief and his own unbelief. So he's believing in God to do two different things there. And in verse 24, it says, that's where he says, "I do believe, help me overcome in my unbelief." And I want you guys to think about any situations where you felt this way and just have that in the back of your mind as we go through this. There may have been something, maybe you're saved and your parents aren't, and you've been praying that they would also get saved or that they would come to church, or maybe you're praying that your mom or dad gets a promotion. Whatever it may be, is there ever a situation where you've had belief in something but you also have doubts in it? Because that's something that we as humans are naturally going to do in our relationship with God. And this our book here wraps it up and wraps up the first point and says this man was raw, sincere, and courageously honest with Jesus. He acknowledged his hard to overcome unbelief right alongside his eager faith and his public declaration when he says, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." Even when we love and believe in Jesus, we may still walk through experiences of deep doubt or persisting unbelief. So the first point, again, is faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive. And the second point is biblical faith is honest human faith. So for this point, we're going to read Matthew. I said there were two chapters, so two passages. And the second passage is Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 through 33. So I'll go ahead and read that. It says, let me find it. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. When he dismissed the crowd, after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. And later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. The disciples even said, "It's a ghost." And they cried out in fear. And then we're in verse 27. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." 28, "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." In verse 29, Jesus says, "Come." And then Peter got down out on the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt me?" And when they climbed into the boat and the wind died down, verse 32. And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. And then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." So something interesting to look at here is how there were many people in the boat. All the disciples, Jesus had sent them onto the other side, and they were all in the boat, and they saw Jesus on the water, and he was walking on the water. That's not normal for humans, right? This is something that no one's ever done before, even to today. People don't just walk across water. And so when the disciples saw this, they thought it was a ghost, and they got really scared. And Jesus told them, "Don't be afraid." And it doesn't say anything about what the other disciples do. All we know is that they stay in the boat, and we see that Peter says, "If it is you, God, tell me to come onto the water." And the interesting thing about that is there's a lot of different commentaries over it, a lot of different routes people take to analyze it, but a lot of people believe and have seen evidence in the Bible of the disciples and their age differences. It's believed that many of the disciples were very young because Jesus was only 30 when he started his ministry, and the disciples in these laws during the Bible's time and in the way society worked during this time, the age of people, whenever they would follow a rabbi or a teacher like Jesus, they would be very young, and it was very common for them to be younger than the teacher themselves. So Jesus was only 30. They were 100% lower or younger than 30. And Peter's the only one that it mentions being married at the time. And all the others throughout the Bible, you see two of them leave their father on a boat. So they were working full time, which during this time period is people started doing that as a young teenager. So I say all this to say that Peter can be seen throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament, being kind of the guinea pig and the guy who always walks forward and steps up. And a lot of people believe that that's because he was one of the older ones, if not the oldest. So he was the most confident. And he says here, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come onto the water." And Peter ends up walking on the water to Jesus. So imagine that you're on the boat and you see this. You'd probably react the same way as all the disciples, right? You'd be terrified that somebody's walking on the water towards you. You might think it's a ghost. You might think it's an evil spirit or something. But Jesus says to them, "Don't be afraid, for it is me," right? And Peter ends up walking on the water to him. And then the point that everybody likes to point out is Peter ends up sinking. Peter loses faith because during this whole thing, there's this huge storm going on, right? Um, Peter loses sight of God. He loses his focus. He's no longer paying attention to him. And he begins to sink, and he cries out to God, would you help me? Would you save me? And Jesus reaches out his hand and picks him up and saves him. And I've preached a sermon or two on this, and I've heard many other sermons on this. And the way that a lot of people like to look at this in a metaphor way is this is very similar, if not exactly similar to many of our walks with Christ, the way many of us walk with Christ, where in life there's going to be storms that happen, and what we've got to try to do is to stay focused on God, and we can walk across the water and walk our path, walk our relationship to God, getting closer to him. But as humans, like I said, we're going to have doubts. We're going to get distracted by that storm that's behind us or in front of us, or that we're in right now. And when I say storm, it's another metaphor for like a hard time in your life. Maybe one of your parents just lost their job, or maybe your parents got divorced, or maybe it's something smaller and your bike got stolen and you ride your bike every day and now you don't know what to do. There's many different size storms, but there's going to be storms in our life that distract us, and then we're going to have doubt. And what we have to do is we have to look at what Peter did whenever he lost out, and he cried out to God and said, let me find where it is. In verse 30, he said, Lord, save me. And in verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him and said, you have little faith, why did you doubt me? So whenever we ask Jesus to help us, he will help us, and might not always feel like it, because the interesting thing to think about is, did Jesus pull him up out of the water and keep him from drowning? Yes. But were they immediately back in the boat? Were they immediately out of the storm? No. I like to think of the boat as heaven, because you see that whenever they get into the boat, the storm went away. There was no longer a storm. It was calm on the waters. The waves went away. But whenever Jesus pulls him up out of the water, he wasn't out of the storm yet. He was still in the storm. So oftentimes Jesus will pull us up out of the water. He'll keep us from sinking, but we won't be out of the storm yet. We're still in our walk with God. We're still trying to get to the boat. So that's important to realize, that whenever you ask for Jesus' help, just because it doesn't feel like it doesn't mean that he's not helping you. So I kind of answer all the questions for point 2, but again, point 1, faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive. Point 2, biblical faith is honest human faith. We're going to have doubts. We're going to lose our focus on Jesus because of the storms we're in. That's the biblical human faith. And then point 3, we can come to Jesus with honesty and sincerity. It's important to be honest with God. I know I'm getting a little long here. I'm going to try to speed it up. The book we have here tells us to go back to the Father with his Son. It's important to see that Jesus didn't shame the Father, like I was saying earlier. Jesus healed his Son. And then when you look at the things that Peter and Jesus were talking about in their interaction, Jesus tries to keep him calm, telling him and the disciples to not be afraid. And Jesus communicates with them constantly, and they communicate with him. I don't know if you can see it. My dog's right here. There's a constant communication between the Father and Jesus, the Father of the Son, and communication between Peter and Jesus. So in our relationship, in our walk with Jesus, we need to be honest and sincere. We need to tell him when we feel like we're drowning, like Peter did. We need to tell him when we have unbelief, like the Father of the Son did. And we just need to ask for his help. And whenever we do that, he'll help us. But it's important to remember that just because it doesn't feel like he's helping us doesn't mean that he's not, right? We just might not be to the boat yet. We're still in the storm, but Jesus has our hand again. And sometimes, as humans, we're going to fail. We're going to fall short. We're going to sin constantly. So sometimes you may have to ask him repeatedly to help you in the same storm. You may find yourself drowning constantly. So just keep asking him, be honest with him, and be honest in your conversation, in your relationship with him. I hope that you guys were able to understand that and to learn from it. I hope you guys can apply it. I hope you guys are enjoying your summertime, your free time. I think if any of you were doing schoolwork, you're all done with it. I hope you guys enjoy it. Stay safe, have fun, and I think we'll be seeing you sooner rather than later in the next month or two. I think they're starting Sunday school back. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you later.